So I want to start today by having you just picture a mental image. Picture the early European explorers, you know, sailing west in the
Yeah,
1500s.
yeah.
We've all seen the movies, right? You've got the conquistadors hacking through these dense jungles, those old parchment maps with "Here be dragons" scrawled on the edges.
Right, the classic cinematic imagery.
Exactly. And if I asked you what they were looking for, what's the very first thing that pops into your head?
It's gold, always gold.
Yeah.
El Dorado, the city of gold.
Right. We have this heavily romanticized cinematic idea that the colonization of the Americas was just, well, that it was entirely about treasure hunting.
Massive chests of doubloons.
Yeah, piles of silver. And sure, I mean, in the beginning, especially if we're talking about the Spanish empires, that was absolutely the case. They wanted to extract wealth directly from the ground.
It was basically, it was classic smash and grab economics. You arrive, you take the shiny rocks, you load them onto a boat, and you leave.
And here's where the story shifts, and frankly, where it gets so much darker and way more complex. Because if you look at the actual data, if you look at what sustained these empires over centuries, it wasn't gold.
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't silver. It was dirt. Or I guess more accurately, what they could force out of that dirt.
That's the pivot.
Yeah.
That is the massive historical pivot.
Yeah.
The move from extraction like mining over to agriculture.
Yeah.
The plantation economy.
And that pivot is exactly what we are unpacking today. We're doing a deep dive into the machinery behind the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
We're basing this on the historical analysis from AP European History Topic 1.9, which covers mercantilism and the plantation economy.
The heavy topic.
It is. But we aren't just looking at a timeline here. We aren't just
Yeah.
saying this happened and then that happened. Our mission today is to look at the actual mechanics.
Right.
The specific economic theories, the biological accidents, really, and the geographic strategies that all converge to create this horrific system.
I really think mechanics is the perfect word for it.
Right.
Because we so often look at the slave trade purely as a moral catastrophe.
Which it undeniably was.
Undeniably. But to understand why it lasted so long and why it grew to be so incredibly massive, you really have to look at it through the eyes of the people running it.
Yeah.
To them, it wasn't a moral issue at all. It was a logistical one. It was this cold, calculated business model designed to solve a very specific set of problems.
Okay, so let's look at that first problem. Put yourself in the shoes of a European monarch, right? You found this quote-unquote new world. Why isn't finding gold enough?
Right.
Why shift to farming?
To answer that, we really have to talk about the operating system of the global economy back then. We call it mercantilism.
Which I'll admit sounds like one of those really dry terms from a high school textbook that just instantly makes your eyes glaze over.
It totally does.
Yeah.
But it's actually an incredibly aggressive concept.
Mm.
You really have to think of mercantilism as economic warfare.
Okay.
The underlying belief was that the world's wealth was finite. There's only so much gold and silver in existence, period. So for my nation to be strong, I have to have the biggest slice of the pie.
Yeah.
And if I have it,
Then I don't.
exactly, it's a zero-sum game. Completely. And in this system, you don't just want to be rich. You want to be completely self-sufficient. You want to export way more than you import.
Because buying things means losing wealth.
Right. If you're England and you are buying sugar from Spain, you are losing the game. You are literally bleeding your wealth to your enemy.
So the goal is to own the farm so you never have to buy the milk?
Exactly. Colonies weren't just about planting a flag and claiming territory. They were captive markets. The strategy was to set up a closed loop.
How did that loop work, practically?
The colony produces the raw materials. We're talking sugar, tobacco, coffee. And they're legally required to send them only to the mother country.
Got it.
And the mother country turns them into finished goods and sells them right back to the colony. No money ever leaves the empire.
And that brings us to the actual crops. Because you can't just grow anything to make this work. You mentioned sugar.
Sugar was the oil of the 17th century.
Oil?
Absolutely. We forget this today because, sugar is so cheap and it's just everywhere. But back then, it was white gold.
Wow.
It was used as a preservative, it was considered a medicine, and most importantly, it was an addiction.
An addiction, like culturally.
Yeah, the European palate completely changed.
Right.
You suddenly have the rise of coffee houses in London, in Paris, chocolate, tea, coffee. All of these are basically just bitter delivery mechanisms for caffeine.
Right, they're super bitter on their own.
Exactly. So to make them palatable to the masses, you needed sugar.
Yeah.
And once people had a taste for it, demand just absolutely skyrocketed.
Okay, so you have this insatiable demand back in Europe. You have the land in the Americas specifically the Caribbean and Brazil, right?
Yes, those are the primary zones.
Because the climate there allows you to grow this stuff year-round.
Favorable climates were everything.
Right. And then you also have the crops, sugar, coffee, tobacco in places like the Chesapeake and later on cotton. And you have the motive, which is mercantilism. But then they hit a wall.
A massive wall.
Yeah.
The labor problem.
Right. Because you can have the best land and the best seeds in the world, but sugarcane is notoriously difficult to harvest.
It's brutal.
It's heavy, it physically cuts you, it's hot, back-breaking work, and you need thousands of people to do it.
And this is where the European powers made a series of really grim calculations. And I want to be incredibly clear here. They tried other things first. They didn't just immediately start with the transatlantic slave trade.
Right, they started with the people who were already living there, the indigenous populations.
Pure brutal logic suggests that would be their first step. You're in their land. There are millions of people. Why not just force them to work the fields?
Which is what the Spanish encomienda system was.
Exactly. The encomienda system was essentially an attempt at indigenous enslavement. But from the colonizers' perspective, it failed.
And according to the source material, it failed for two very specific reasons that really have nothing to do with, like, a willingness to work and everything to do with biology and geography.
Yes. Let's break those down. Geography first. Think about it from a security standpoint. If you enslave a person on their own land, they have the ultimate home field advantage.
They know the terrain.
They know the terrain perfectly. They know where the caves are, where the hidden water sources are, which plants are poisonous, and which are edible.
So if they escape, they don't just wander into the wilderness and die. They can survive. They can just disappear.
They can disappear, and more importantly, they can regroup. Resistance was constant. It became a complete logistical nightmare for the Europeans to try and keep indigenous populations captive in their own backyard.
That makes sense.
But the bigger factor, the one that really decimated the labor force, was biological.
Disease factor.
It was an absolute apocalypse. We're talking about smallpox, measles, influenza. You have to remember, the indigenous populations of the Americas had been physically isolated from the Afro-Eurasian landmass for over 10,000 years.
I've heard this referred to as virgin soil epidemics.
That's the exact historical term. See, over in Europe, Africa, and Asia, people had been living in very close proximity to domesticated animals for millennia. Cows, pigs, chickens.
And that matters because diseases jump.
Right. Most of our worst historical diseases jump from animals to humans. So old world populations had gradually built up this massive genetic library of immunity. They got sick, sure, but they didn't all die.
But over in the Americas, they didn't have those large domesticated animals. No cows, no pigs.
Exactly. So when the Europeans arrived, they brought a biological weapon they didn't even fully understand themselves. Mortality rates for indigenous populations were upwards of 90% in some areas.
90%. That's just staggering.
It is. And from a purely economic standpoint, you cannot build a stable engine of commerce when your entire workforce is literally dying out within weeks of contact.
So, okay, put yourself back in the mindset of the European plantation owner. He's looking at his ledger. He has the sugar. He has the booming market back in London. But his local labor force is either dead or has escaped into the mountains. He needs a replacement. And this is where the conversation turns to the pivot toward Africa.
And this is the exact moment where the cold logic of the system becomes just absolutely terrifying. The colonizers needed a labor force that solved the two specific problems they had with the indigenous population. They needed someone who was physically present to do the work, but socially dead.
Socially dead. What does that mean in this context?
It means someone who has absolutely no connection to the land. If you kidnap a person from Angola and you drop them in Jamaica, they're completely alienated.
They don't know the terrain.
They don't know the terrain. They don't even speak the language of the other captive people around them necessarily because they were often mixed intentionally. They have nowhere to run. That solves the geography problem completely.
Wow. And the biology problem?
Well, Africans, much like Europeans, had been part of that massive old world disease exchange for centuries. So they already had exposure to smallpox and measles. They had immunity. But there was another biological factor that actually made African labor, quote unquote, more valuable in the twisted eyes of the colonizers. And that was malaria resistance.
Wait, really?
Malaria? Yes. The tropical climates of the Caribbean and Brazil were just rife with malaria and yellow fever. These were diseases that were killing Europeans in droves. They couldn't handle the climate.
So how did African populations factor into that?
Many West African populations carried specific genetic traits, like the sickle cell trait that provided them with some natural protection against malaria.
So, let me get this straight. In this incredibly twisted, dehumanizing calculation, an African captive was viewed as a safer investment because they wouldn't die from European diseases and they also wouldn't die from tropical fevers.
Precisely. It was treated as a brutal asset management decision. They literally looked at human beings and checked boxes. Immune to smallpox? Check. Unlikely to successfully escape? Check. Capable of surviving the intense tropical climate?
That is just chilling. It completely strips away any semblance of humanity and reduces millions of living people to specks on a balance sheet.
That was the absolute essence of the mercantile system. It commodified everything. And once that terrible decision was made, it required a delivery mechanism.
Right.
They needed a way to move that labor from point A to point B on a massive industrial scale.
Which brings us to the Middle Passage.
The Middle Passage, the brutal middle leg of the triangular trade connecting Europe, Africa, and the New World.
I think most people have a general sense of this from school, horrific conditions, incredibly crowded ships. But when you look at the actual source material, when you read the logs from the shipping companies, it wasn't just crowded, it was mathematically maximized.
It was an efficiency equation. The voyage took anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the weather and the specific route. And captains and shipping companies actually sat in boardrooms and debated 2 different operational strategies, loose packing versus tight packing.
You're kidding. Those were the actual industry terms.
Those were the literal terms they used. Loose packing meant giving captives slightly more room, with the hope of lowering the mortality rate so you arrived with healthier, more valuable people.
And tight packing.
Tight packing was the dominant belief that you should cram as many human beings as physically possible into the hold, literally stacking them like spoons, inches apart. Because the accountants calculated that even if 20 or 30% of them died en route, the sheer volume of the survivors would yield a higher total profit.
So they priced in the death. They fully expected it.
They expected it, and they insured against it. This era is actually the birth of modern insurance markets. You could take out policies on your, quote, cargo.
Unbelievable.
If there was a rebellion or a shipwreck, or they ran out of food and threw people overboard, the investors were covered. It turned the destruction of human life into a fully recoverable financial loss.
And the conditions inside those holds, I was reading that the lack of sanitation wasn't just like casual neglect. It was a direct physical consequence of the tight packing.
There was simply no way to access sanitation. People were chained in place for weeks, sometimes months. They were forced to lie sideways just to fit, lying in their own waste, in vomit, in blood.
And the heat must have been unimaginable.
The heat was unbearable. The air below deck was so foul and so devoid of oxygen that a candle literally wouldn't burn. Malnourishment and disease were rampant.
And yet, despite the horror, despite the fact that sailors wrote about how they could smell these slave ships from miles away before they even saw them on the horizon, the system didn't stop. It actually accelerated.
Because the profit margins were simply too high to ignore. The demand for sugar and tobacco in Europe was so intense that a planter in the Caribbean could buy an enslaved person, literally work them to death in 7 years, buy a replacement, and still make a massive, massive profit.
The math worked for them.
The math worked. And the Middle Passage was just the supply line that kept that horrific machine fed.
Okay, so the ships arrive. The survivors of this 2 to 6 week nightmare are unloaded in Brazil or in Barbados or Virginia, and they step into a world that is structured completely differently than anything back in Europe.
Very differently.
The source material calls these planter societies.
And this is a crucial distinction. In Europe, you had poor people and rich people, right? Standard class division. But in the Caribbean and parts of the Americas, you had a demographic pressure cooker.
How so?
Because the wealth was hyper-concentrated in the hands of a tiny European elite. In some of these colonies, the enslaved African population outnumbered the white Europeans 10 to 1.
That sounds incredibly dangerous for the people in charge.
It's a recipe for constant insurrection.
Yeah.
So to maintain control, the colonizers knew they couldn't just rely on brute physical force forever. They were too outnumbered. They needed a social structure that made unity impossible.
They needed to engineer a hierarchy.
Exactly. Strict racial hierarchy. And this is where we see the invention of heavily codified race laws.
Right. And it gets incredibly granular, doesn't it? The source mentions the casta system in Spanish America.
Yes, the casta system is a prime example of this social engineering. This wasn't just a simple white versus black binary. It was a complex, Legally binding taxonomy based on your exact racial mixture.
Like a chart.
Literally a chart. They had these Costa paintings that they used to categorize people. It showed, for example, a European father and an indigenous mother producing a, quote, mestizo child. A Spaniard and an African producing a mulatto.
Wow.
There were dozens of categories: castizo, Morisco, albino, all defining exactly what percentage of European blood you had.
But why go to all that trouble? Why categorize everyone so obsessively like that?
Divide and conquer.
Oh.
You've created a ladder, and you tell the person on the second rung from the bottom, hey, at least you aren't on the very bottom rung. They will fight tooth and nail to protect their status.
We'll punch down instead of punching up.
Exactly. It incentivized people of mixed race, or free people of color, to identify with the European elites rather than uniting with the enslaved Africans. It created a built-in buffer class.
So the racism itself wasn't just a byproduct of the slavery. It was the specific tool invented to manage it.
That is exactly right. It was the security system. By tying legal rights, taxes, and social standing directly to the, quote, purity of your blood, they ensured that the vast majority of population would never, ever unite against that tiny minority elite.
And this structure, this massive concentration of wealth and power, it became a self-reinforcing cycle.
Highly self-reinforcing.
Because the more money the plantations made, the more political power they had to write these laws, which let them import more labor, which made them more money.
And the more they expanded. And you have to remember, this wealth did not stay in the Americas. It flowed directly back to Europe, feeding that mercantilist loop we talked about at the start. It built the great European cities. It funded the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engines and the factories that came later. They were often funded by capital accumulated directly through the Triangle Trade.
And the raw materials fed those factories, too.
Exactly. The cotton that fed the massive textile mills in Manchester came directly from the slave plantations in the American South. The entire system linked European commerce, African labor, and American production into one unbreakable chain.
It's all connected. You really can't separate the rise of the modern Western economy from this deeply exploitative foundation.
You really can't. It created a global economy where money and goods moved completely freely, but millions of human beings were literally shackled.
You know, when we started this deep dive, we talked about that shift from mining gold to growing sugar. It seems like such a relatively small historical detail, just a change in commodity.
Yeah.
But when you actually trace the lines out, that one economic decision completely reshaped the entire world.
It really did. It changed the genetic makeup of entire continents. It forcibly moved millions of people across an ocean. It literally created the concept of race and racial hierarchy as we know it today.
All because of crops?
All because the mercantile system demanded a product that could be grown efficiently in the New World, and they needed a way to harvest it without paying for labor.
It really makes you look at history differently. I think we often think of historical events as inevitable, you know, like a flowing river that just goes where it goes. But listening to this, studying these sources, this feels way more like a machine that was built piece by people making very deliberate choices.
That is the big picture synthesis here. It was machine. It was not an accident of history. It was built on the intersection of very specific things: economic incentives, mercantilism, biological realities like disease immunity, and geographic strategies like isolation and the trade winds.
The why really matters. If we just look back and say, slavery was bad, we miss the actual mechanics of it. We have to understand why it happened and how it was justified, so we can recognize when those exact same mechanics start to spin up again in different ways.
That is the ultimate lesson of studying this era. Systems themselves don't have morals. People do. But if you build an economic system designed purely for maximum extraction and profit, it will devour absolutely anything you feed it, including human beings.
A really heavy but absolutely necessary deep dive today.
I agree completely. It's essential history.
We'll leave you with a final thought to mull over today. The source material notes that knowledge is most valuable when we understand the why. So, if the transatlantic slave trade was driven by the incredibly specific mechanics of disease immunity and geography just as much as it was by raw economics, how does that change our understanding of the inevitability of history?
It's a great question.
How much of our history was a deliberate human choice, and how much of it was just biology and economics driving the bus? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.